Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'm taking a look at my currently inked pens. I'll be doing a writing sample with each one of them in my Hobonichi Weeks with 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. I've got two Conklin mini graphs. One has a stub nib and one has an extra fine. They're both inked up with Iroshizuku Murasaki Shikibu. I've got a Pilot Custom 98 with a 14 karat medium nib that's inked up with Herbin Rouge Granat, a FaberCastell Ambition with a stainless steel broad nib, and it's inked up with Pannonia Cheerio Water Bus, and a PIM-BBS 308 that I installed a Nimicine .6 stub nib in yesterday, and this pen has pleasantly surprised me. I've got it inked up with Iroshizuku Yuyaki. I've also got a few pens over here that I'm needing to clean out that have been dip tested, and it's been a couple days since I wrote with them, and most of them are still writing really well. So we'll take a look and see which pens kept the ink wet over this couple of days after just being dip tested. First, I'm going to write with my Conklin Mini Graph in the white satin finish. It has a stainless steel stub nib. I haven't written with these two mini graphs for 3 days, so I'm curious to see how well the cap seals. Okay, a bit of a hard start there. All right. This little stub nib has been a pleasure to write with. I have had just little tiny hard starts with it, but then once you get it writing, no issues. I want to check the reverse writing. Yeah, originally when I first inked this up, I thought this could be a nice reverse writer, but no, the reverse writing is just too dry. Next, I've got another Conklin mini graph. This time it's in the Purple Dunes finish. It's kind of like a tortoiseshell finish with little bits of purple in it. And again, just that little bit of a hard start. I did a lot of work on this nib when I first bought this pen, but now I have it in a shape that I do really enjoy it. I've used it for some note-taking this past week, and between the normal extra fine writing and the reverse writing, let me show that. I really like the fine line that this reverse puts down, and it's nice and wet, but it puts down a very crisp line, and it's about a nib size finer. I don't know how much that's showing up here on camera, but it is noticeably finer, so it makes a nice versatile nib when I'm note-taking. I can write some things with a bolder line and do bullet points in a finer line, and I just like the way my notes look, and it's very pleasant. In fact, I mentioned this in a previous video. The reverse writing is smoother than the regular writing. The regular writing has that pencil-y feedback like a sailor nib has, and the reverse writing is nice and smooth like a Pilot fine nib. It's been really enjoyable to play with, but I did have to do work on this nib to get it to write like this. Now, one thing I want to mention, one reason I was kind of concerned about how well the cap is sealing is because I've noticed after I had these two pens inked up for a couple days, Murasaki Shikibu is looking very dark. When I originally inked up the pen, you can see it was much lighter, and this is what I'm used to Murasaki Shikibu looking like. Whenever I used it in the past, in like my Prera and other pens, it's this more pale pastel purple, but now you can see how much darker it is. And that's okay with me. I really like this darker version. And I just want to show different writing tests I've done after the pen has set for a couple days, or set for a day, or overnight, really. After the pen has set overnight, you get just a little bit of a dry start, not necessarily completely dry. And this is on both pens. There's the stub nib, and here's the extra fine. I think maybe this one had set overnight and this one had set for a couple days, but then once it starts writing, no more issues during the course of a note-taking session. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom 98. It has a snap cap that has that snap similar to a Pilot Prera, or the same snap cap that a Pilot Stargazer had, or a Pilot Legno. It has a 14 karat number 3 size medium nib. My Pilot Legno, and I have a couple Pilot Legnos and a Stargazer, I can use them unposted, but this pen just seems so lightweight unposted, that I always post it, and it is just so nicely balanced. That cap ring just presses into my hand right there. This nib is very wet, and you can see here on the B it puts down so much ink that I kind of drug some ink there and left a little smear. But this is a very pleasant pen to write with. I usually write in my journal. I have a Leuchtturm's Some Lines a Day 5-year journal, and there's no lines on that paper, so I can write as big or as small as I need to, and this is just a pleasure to write with on that paper. Let me look at the reverse writing. Yeah, too dry. Some of these little Pilot Gold nibs are really nice reverse writers, and some of them are just too dry. They're not designed to be reverse writers, so if you get one that is good, it's just kind of the luck of the draw. You're just fortunate to have one. Next, I've got a FaberCastell Ambition in the Flamingo finish. I've been saying I need to clean this pen out for several days, but every time I pick it up, it's still writing. So it's been out of ink, the converter's been out of ink. I've just been using the ink left in the feed for a few days now, so I don't know if it's going to write. But this has become my go-to pen for Pannonia Cheerio Water Bus. When I bought this pen, it came with an extra fine stainless steel nib, but I bought a replacement stainless steel broad nib. And it has finally dried up. Let me see. Yeah. Here's a previous writing sample for Cheerio Water Bus. This has been a really nice ink to use on poor quality paper as well as good fountain pen friendly paper. Well, I do want to go ahead and mention about this pen. It has been a champ. Um, the first pen that I put Cheerio Water Bus in was my Leonardo Momento Zero in the jade finish. And Cheerio Water Bus is like a teal turquoisey ink that has a blue pigment in it that is super saturated and will settle out kind of like shimmer settles out of the ink. And I would, let's see, this converter doesn't have any type of ink agitator in it. So you would see the pigment settle out, and before I would write with it every day, I would just agitate the pen back and forth, kind of spin it around, and over time, that pigment stopped reincorporating in the ink. And when I got down to just the last little bit, I would have some hard starts. I never had that issue with my Ambition because the FaberCastell converter has this ink agitator in it. Now, I know a lot of people don't like these ink agitators. Some people just don't like the sound of it rattling back and forth. Some people feel like it makes the converter more difficult to clean out, but it did its job with this ink. Every time that I picked up the pen to use it, I would just rotate it back and forth just once. I would hear the little ink agitator click a couple times, and then I would start writing. I never had an issue. Anytime I checked, I didn't have that pigment settled in the converter. Just using the pen kept the pigment incorporated in the ink. So that turquoisey ink looks good with this flamingo pink finish, so it's going to be my go-to ink. And finally, I've got my Pen BBS 308 that I haven't used in at least 3 years, maybe closer to 4 years. These 308s don't have a lot of room between the cap and the nib, and probably 4 or 5 years ago, I tried to put a Nemesign stub nib in here, but there wasn't enough room. I couldn't close the cap completely. Well, I was thinking about getting a Pen BBS 456 to use my stub nib in, but I wanted to test it with a Pen BBS feed first because the issue I have with this nib, I've tried it in a couple of Jen Hao pens, I tried it in a Moonman M800, and the feed just can't keep up with this nib. So when I was installing the nib in the section, I noticed that the little sleeve that the nib fits into was cracked. So I've got a bag of Pen BBS parts. I got a new sleeve out and screwed it in. And then I wanted to see just how much shy I was of being able to cap the pen. And when I tested it, I've got about a millimeter of room. I'm able to cap it. So I don't know if that previous sleeve, maybe there was enough variation in this other sleeve that, or I don't know, maybe I didn't have the nib pushed in all the way. I don't know what it was, but I discovered that I am able to cap it now, so that's nice. But when I first inked it up, I kind of primed the feed a little bit to get some ink flowing and then pulled it back, and it was just writing too wet. And I thought, well, is this like my M800 where it will write too wet for a while and then totally dry up? And I wrote 2 A5 pages and it was still just writing super wet. So I turned the pen upright and used the converter to push all the air slowly out of the feed. And I heard the ink bubbling through the feed. I didn't see any being pushed out, but it was bubbling. And then I pulled the plunger completely back and sucked some air through the feed. And now it still writes pretty wet, but not uncomfortably wet. So let's take a look at it. Here's the stainless steel 0.6 stub nib. You can see up there, it's not a crisp stub at all. This is the kind of stub nib I like that's really rounded. and it still writes really wet, but at least I'm able to see some shading. I haven't tested this for reverse writing. Oh, that feels nice. Still very wet, but it's a little bit drier than the regular writing. And a little bit finer. Yeah, still pretty wet. That's nice. Now, I've got 2 of these Nimicine stub nibs, and I had quite a bit of trouble with this one, getting the tines aligned and getting it smoothed. I had to spend quite a bit of time on it yesterday. Now, the other Nimicine stub nib I've got installed in this Fully Win, and it's the one that I've used the most. I haven't had as much trouble with the tines getting out of alignment, and once I smooth it, it stays pretty smooth. But this one yesterday, I would get the tines aligned and I would put it in the pen and then they were out of a line and I would try to line them up again in the pen, would have a bit of trouble. It was just a lot of back and forth. Now that I've got it writing good and it's nice and smooth, I'm not going to be taking it out of the pen. And I want to do just some quick writing samples with these pens that I did writing tests with earlier in a previous video. Let's see. This is Herbin Bleu Myosotis, and let's see how it's done in my Jinhao X750. This is usually the first pen to dry out. Whenever I do these dip tests, this has just been dipped in ink. I've done some writing samples with it and then set to the side for a day. And this is usually the first pen to really dry up. This ink, when I did these writing samples with it, felt really dry, but it's actually a very watery ink. So I suppose since it's not very saturated, doesn't have as much dye in it, perhaps has more water, I suppose. The reason it feels less lubricated and it stays wetter in the pen. That surprised me. Let's see. I've got a Kaweco Lilliput with a broad nib. Yep. It feels like it's running out of ink though, but I don't know. It's just, I think, putting down less ink than that stub nib, the 1.5 stub nib on the Jinhao. Now this one surprised me. This is a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. And it was writing very wet when we were doing these writing samples. It's the one that was completely dried up. And I know when I go to clean it, there's going to be ink in there. I don't know if, since it's just been dipped in ink, if the ink, the capillary action has pulled the ink back up into the feed, away from the nib. But this one, oh, hold on. It wants to write, but lots of skipping. So I know there's some ink up in there. I've got a Pilot Explorer with the steel medium nib. This is writing very dry. Yeah, there's ink in there, but it's just writing very dry. I've got a Pilot Grants with a 14 karat fine nib, and I expected it to be dried up like the Custom Heritage, but I was wrong. This is writing beautifully. Love that one. And I've got a Sailor 1911 with a 14 karat medium nib. It's a standard. Now, on the paper I was using earlier, it was just not great fountain pen paper. This nib felt really nice. It just feels a little too dry on this smooth paper. I'm liking the Grants best so far. I've got a Pilot Lucina with a steel fine nib. And to my pleasant surprise, it's writing just as nicely. I mean, it feels just like the Pilot Grants. Oh, I didn't write Lucina. Very nice. I mean, just as wet as the Pilot Grants. And this nib, I believe, is slightly larger than a number 5 size nib. It's not flexy, but I just feel the slightest amount of cushion. Maybe not as much as the number 5 size gold nib on my Custom 74, but it definitely feels a bit more cushiony than those number 5 steel nibs. And finally, my Pilot Kakuno. I was expecting it to still write because it puts down such a small amount of ink that when I do a dip test, it will just write forever. But just like the Custom Heritage 91, there's probably ink up in there, but it is just not down here at the tip of the nib. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.